is some video evidence that there are North Korean soldiers either on their way or actually in Russia. I mean, there's also evidence that the North Koreans have had people in the Donbass for some time doing reconstruction operations. They've provided munitions. So I think, whilst we can't say it's an absolute certainty until we see these people on the front lines or at some area in Ukraine, there's a very strong possibility that within the coming weeks we will see North Koreans in Ukraine and potentially in combat against Ukrainian soldiers.
Hello and welcome to Frontline from Times Radio. My name is Alex Dibble, Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today we're joined by Major General Mick Ryan, who served in the Australian Army for more than 30 years. He is Adjunct Fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and Senior Fellow for Military Studies at the Lowy Institute. His new book is called The War for Ukraine. Major General Mick Ryan, thank you very much for joining Frontline.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
I thought we would start with something that Professor Scott Lucas told Frontline yesterday, in fact, which was that, in his view, Ukraine could be willing to negotiate with Russia to freeze front lines if it is given NATO membership. I wondered what you make of that as a proposal or as an idea.
Well, it's certainly in the range of possibilities, but I think it's a low probability. I mean, Ukraine has said all along it wants all its territory back. So even if there was some kind of ceasefire, that would not infer that Ukraine was giving up on getting back its territory in eastern and southern Ukraine, including Crimea. So is it possible? I guess so. But at the end of the day, Ukraine would not want that to be seen as negotiating away the territory that's already occupied by Russia illegally.
What about from Russia's perspective? How likely is it, do you think, that Vladimir Putin would be willing to enter peace negotiations with Ukraine if that was the offer on the table?
Once again, it's possible, but at the end of the day, Putin probably sees himself in a more advantageous position at the moment. I think that the strategic momentum has shifted back in Russia's favour after, a few weeks in Kursk when it became clear that the Ukrainians were at the maximum extent of their incursion there. Russia has continued to advance on multiple axes in eastern Ukraine. It certainly hasn't taken all of the Donbass, and it probably hasn't achieved what it wanted to achieve this year. But in winning the story of the war, the Ukrainians are probably ahead. They probably have sufficiently influenced the views of Western politicians to have them believe that Russia is in the ascendancy at the moment. So Russia will probably wait for a better deal from the West, and it will probably wait until it sees the outcome of the US election, until it makes any decisions about its future trajectory in this war.
If Ukraine is able to freeze the front lines as they are, either through negotiation or through the incoming winter, do you think Vladimir Putin has gained enough in the Donbass to justify Russia's losses over the summer?
He will tell his people that story if it comes to it, but at the end of the day, he's taken huge casualties to take small bits of territory. Over the course of this calendar year, he's probably lost about 500 soldiers for every square kilometre gained. That is not a very good return on investment whatsoever. But at the end of the day, if there is an agreement, he'll tell the Russian people whatever he wants them to believe. He controls all the media and those kind of things in Russia. But I don't think he really is after a deal at the moment. I think he believes that he can take more. And whatever he does take, and wherever the front lines might be frozen, he will just see that as the start point for a subsequent operation, very similar to what he's done in Chechnya. At the end of the day, Putin has kind of painted himself into a corner where he's got to continue this war because of how he's mobilised the Russian state in a war effort. So I really don't see him agreeing to any negotiations in the short term.
Again, we're speaking hypothetically, and as you mentioned a moment ago, there may be many reasons why Ukraine would not want to enter a negotiation of this type. But in a scenario where it was a NATO member, but had to cede the territory that Russia has gained. How big a challenge do you think that would be for NATO to have that type of Ukraine as a member with those boundaries?
Well, I think the first challenge would be if there was a freezing of the front line, as you said, as a hypothetical, who's going to guarantee that? What, we're going to leave it to the Russians and the Ukrainians to guarantee that frozen front line, given that it's very likely it'll be violated at some point. So someone will have to get in there, get between those forces. I don't see a single country in the world putting their hand up to provide that military force at this point in time. So once again, I just see this freezing the front line as a bit fantastical, unless certain countries put up their hands and say we're going to guarantee that. Next, if Ukraine is in NATO, which countries in NATO at this point in time are willing to go into bat for Ukraine if Russia then decides to transgress into its territory once Ukraine has joined NATO? I mean, once again, you see a whole bunch of countries that frankly have shown absolutely no willingness to go out on a limb on Ukraine's behalf during this war, particularly in Western Europe. The United States certainly isn't willing to do that. So both guarantee a frozen front line and guaranteeing Ukraine's security once it does join NATO is very, very problematic at the moment.
I thought we could move on to talk about something that is really emerging over the last few weeks, which is North Korea's involvement in this conflict. South Korea's intelligence agency says a force of 1,500 North Korean soldiers has arrived in Russia's Far East in preparation for deployment in Ukraine. What do you know of this information, and how likely do you think it is that they will be deployed on the front lines?
Well, I think there's some corroborating evidence there. I mean, South Korean intelligence agencies are pretty good, as are the Ukrainians. Both of them believe this is going to happen. There is some video evidence that there are North Korean soldiers either on their way or actually in Russia. I mean, there's also evidence that the North Koreans have had people in the Donbass for some time doing reconstruction operations. They've provided munitions. So I think, whilst we can't say it's an absolute certainty until we see these people on the front lines or at some area in Ukraine, there's a very strong possibility that within the coming weeks we will see North Koreans in Ukraine and potentially in combat against Ukrainian soldiers.
What do we know about whether Russians and the Russian military, I suppose, speak any North Korean, or whether North Koreans and their military speak any Russian? Because, of course, communication is so vital on the front line.
Well, I think it's very unlikely that many Russians, particularly soldiers and junior leaders, speak North Korean. I mean, most of them don't even speak Ukrainian, and that's their next door neighbour, and it's a similar language, not the same. So I think this will be an issue for both the Russians and the North Koreans. They're certain to have translators, but in the heat of battle, when you're on the radio and you speak two different languages and you don't have a translator, that is a major issue. If you need to coordinate support such as artillery, fire support, or just have your friends stop shooting at you in a blue-on-blue kind of incident. So I think that will be an issue. It's been an issue for Ukraine throughout this war. I mean, Foreign Legion people who don't speak Ukrainian, that is an issue. The differences in doctrine between NATO and Ukraine has been an issue. So, this is far from a new challenge. Countries, even like Australia and the US, still have challenges sometimes working together. We speak the same language and have worked together for nearly 100 years. This will be a significant challenge for the North Koreans and the Russians.
In terms of what kind of troops they're sending, what kind of people North Korea is sending, South Korea has claimed that among them is a man called Ri Song-jin, a missile technician who oversees the performance of KN-23 missiles from North Korea that they are supplying to Russia for use in Ukraine. What do we know about these missiles and the significance of sending a technician of that nature over into Russia?
Well, I assume that they would have done this already, given that they're providing munitions and missiles to Russia over the last few months. Given that there have been flights between Russia and North Korea I find it hard to credit that the North Koreans haven't already done this. So I'd say it would be very likely that they're sending all kinds of specialists, not just to help Russia with the North Korean missiles, but to learn the technical lessons of modern war, the use of electronic warfare, the use of drones, the tactics for combining drones, ballistic and cruise missiles in attacking Ukraine. So they will be sending a whole range of, I think, different specialists from artillery to armour to special operations to infantry to learn the wide array of different lessons that it's possible to learn in this war.
I mean, South Korea's fear is that Russia will be offering something to North Korea in return, and that could be information and technology on, high value weapons and maybe even nuclear weapons. What's your view on the negotiation, the agreement that there must have been, we presume, and South Korea presumes, between the two nations in order for North Korea to be sending troops?
Well, I think if there'll be a scale of more likely to least likely in the kind of return that Russia will provide. I think most likely will be things like hard currency. That's one thing the North Koreans are always short of. They will get it as payment for the use of these soldiers, but also in the wages of North Koreans that are already working in Russia, in Siberia, and in occupied Ukraine. So I think that's very, very likely. I think what's also likely is they will expose the North Koreans to the lessons of modern war, both through their personal participation, but through briefings. Likely will be things like transfer of technologies, whether they're drones, whether it is how they've reduced their kill chain times, whether it is how they have trained their own soldiers in different forms of tactics for the war. And I think it's also possible that they might provide the North Koreans with the lessons the Russians have gleaned from exploiting captured Western weapons. I mean, the Russians have a program to capture and exploit every possible Western weapon that's been given to Ukraine, so they may share these. I think less likely is sharing lessons that allow the North Koreans to improve the accuracy and the reliability of their nuclear arsenal and the nuclear delivery weapons. I mean, even the Russians, I think, aren't crazy enough to give someone like Kim Jong-un a better capacity to deploy nuclear weapons. I don't know how Russia would see that being in their best interests. They are a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I think they would probably think twice about doing that. I don't know that says they definitely won't, but that's probably one of the less likely technical transfers that the Russians might undertake.
So despite the seemingly very friendly relationship between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, you think in Vladimir Putin's mind, he still has that caution when it comes to the North Korean leader?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Australia and the United States are extraordinarily friendly, but they're not giving us nuclear weapons. So, nuclear weapons are a very different category of weapon. Those that have them have international and moral obligations not to share them or not to share the technology. I think even the Russians, for all their brutal and immoral behaviour in Ukraine, still feel some limited obligation not to proliferate this technology. Or, sorry, at least I hope they still feel that.
Indeed. And what about the West's response? If North Korean troops are in Ukraine, how do you think Zelensky may have known it for a while, Ukraine has known it for a while, but how do you think the West will respond as the evidence of this becomes more and more irrefutable? I mean, Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, has described it as a major, or rather a significant escalation if this is taking place.
No, I agree with the NATO Secretary General. It's a major escalation because from day one of this war, NATO countries, which includes the United States, of course, have gone to great pains to not have boots on the ground so it doesn't escalate this war beyond the boundaries of Ukraine. Russia has gone there, to be quite frank. It has busted through that I guess, self-imposed taboo that NATO has imposed on itself by bringing in a co-belligerent that will participate in the full range of combat operations against Ukraine on the ground and in long-range strikes. NATO, I think, will have to fundamentally reassess its strategy for the war in Ukraine. This has become now a global conflict, unfortunately. If NATO doesn't want it to further escalate and further co-belligerents to join in, it's going to have to act decisively. It's going to have to shift from sloganeering, like for as long as it takes, to actually embracing a strategy that sees Russia beaten in Ukraine. Whether it does that or not, because of the consensus model in NATO, is another matter. I personally think that's probably not going to happen, unfortunately.
I mean, the question that the casual observer would make to this is, does it make it more likely that NATO troops would be on the ground in Ukraine if Russia has crossed that line? Is that justification? Will NATO use that justification to say, well, we will do the same in that case?
Well, theoretically it is. I think under the laws of armed conflict, possibly it is. But once again, NATO can't take action unless all members of NATO agree. I think it is impossible to conceive of countries such as Hungary, for example, agreeing to any NATO intervention in Ukraine, unfortunately. So I think NATO action is very unlikely. Slightly more likely would be intervention by regional countries, potentially Poland and these kind of countries. But even then, 10,000 North Korean troops is not going to make a significant dent in this war. They are not going to change the trajectory of the war. That's about 9 days losses for the Russians at this point in time. So, we need to also remain realistic about the impact of these North Korean troops, unless they significantly up the number and the time of the deployed troops.
And in terms of, maybe even denying that this is happening from a Russian perspective, we had Ukrainian media this month reporting that 6 North Korean soldiers had been killed in a missile strike in eastern Donetsk. If these troops are, even in that small number, able to be observed by Ukraine, then 1,500 is going to be pretty obvious. Vladimir Putin won't be able to hide them, will he?
No, he won't. But the Russians also understand that there's a proportion of the population in the West who believe the garbage that Russia puts out. There's a proportion of people who believe these lies that Russia Today and other instruments of Russian propaganda put out, including in the United States, and that it has an influence on politics. So he doesn't care whether the leadership of NATO knows it or not. He doesn't care whether Western leaders believe it or not. He knows there are just enough useful idiots in the West who believe what Russia is saying about this war, and then that has just enough influence on Western politics to make them just risk adverse enough for his purposes.
And I suppose the final element of this is, will North Korean troops in Ukraine make it more likely that South Korea would consider upping its support for Ukraine in various ways and potentially supplying weapons or anything else?
Well, that's the real question. So far, South Korea has provided non-lethal assistance to Ukraine. It has also provided a huge amount of munitions to the United States military, so the United States military can then provide its own munitions to Ukraine. So we shouldn't minimise the support that the Republic of Korea, South Korea, has provided already, but they could potentially, in an act of displeasure or a balancing, could decide to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine. They have a wide array of world-class military equipment that would be very useful. The Poles have already bought K9 artillery, K2 tanks, and other systems from the Republic of Korea. Potentially, the South Koreans could decide to provide this to Ukraine. But, they, have been very careful so far in this war. I expect that they will continue to be careful. They will be looking at how might the Koreans who go into combat in Ukraine bring back lessons that improve the overall quality of the North Korean military. That will be deeply concerning to them.
We're speaking in late October. Winter is coming, which always seems to be a very important phase of any year with regard to the war. What's your sense of the next steps that both sides will be looking to take as they prepare for winter and indeed as winter passes?
Well, I think both sides will be trying to undertake whatever ground operations they can before cross country mobility degrades significantly because of rain. Now, it rains at different rates in different parts of Ukraine. It's not all the same. Some places are more muddy than others. But by and large, by November, end of November, the ability to conduct ground operations is significantly reduced, although it doesn't stop entirely in Ukraine. Uh, the Russians, I believe, are probably getting ready for another long-range strike campaign to, destroy as much of the power distribution and generation network that they can in Ukraine. They've already done a large part of that. Ukraine's generation capacity is probably lower than it has been since the beginning of the war. So, the Russians really want to terrorize the Ukrainian people to hopefully force as many of them as possible to leave Ukraine, but also to have them place pressure on the Ukrainian government to go into some kind of negotiation, which is not favourable to the Ukrainian state. So that's what I think is coming up in the coming months. And, at the moment, the situation for Ukraine is pretty grim, but they've been in grim circumstances before and come back.
With regard to the prospect of Ukraine coming back, President Zelensky has presented his victory plan not only to Ukrainian politicians very recently, but also to other world leaders. There's a lot in it that is obviously detailed, but in terms of the broad brushstrokes, is your assessment that it is essentially a rehashing of other proposals that have been in place for a long time, or do you think there's some genuinely new stuff in there?
Well, there's nothing particularly new in the 5 elements of the plan that he described to the Ukrainian Parliament and to the European Council. There are some classified elements. We don't know what they are, and that's fine. You would hope there are some secret elements to take the Russians by surprise. But by and large, most of the things in here are initiatives that he has put forward before, whether it was the 10-point plan to the G20 in 2022, to his speeches to the US Congress and to other bodies in Europe and the United Nations. But I think this victory plan really, at the moment, is seen by the Ukrainian president as this kind of last gasp request to the West that it change its strategy and it change its resources, i.e., increases and speeds it up to support Ukraine. Whether it will or not remains to be seen, but the reaction so far in the US and in Europe appears to have been fairly lukewarm. No one's really come out and said, no, we fully support this, we're going to fully resource it. Maybe that's to come, but at this point in time, unfortunately, it hasn't been met with rounding cheers and changes in strategy or resourcing.
And I'm going to ask, this is just a hunch. I'm going to ask for your hunch based on all your experience. We happen to be speaking now 2 weeks before the US election. We know, and we've said many a time, observations on Donald Trump's claim that he will end the war within 24 hours. Give me a percentage. What percentage chance do you think there will be that the Ukraine conflict in its sort of current form will still be taking place in March of next year if Donald Trump wins the White House in 2 weeks' time?
About 99.9% chance. This myth, this fantasy that you can make 2 phone calls and the war's over in 24 hours. I mean, it's physically impossible. And frankly, the 2 belligerents, Ukraine and Russia, are too far apart for some kind of short-term decision and negotiation like that. So, I think this lightweight, shallow, I can do it in 24 hours approach is a fantasy. I think anyone with any serious strategic training and experience understands that. The Ukrainians certainly understand that, and Putin understands it very well. He is probably rubbing his hands in anticipation of having potentially someone like that in the White House. I think Zelensky has wisely hedged his bets in meeting with both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. He needs a relationship with both of them. He has to be very pragmatic in his position. I think that's the right thing to do. But where it will go is hard to predict, because at the end of the day, whilst Donald Trump thinks he's the most powerful man in the world, the reality is not everyone marches to the tune of the US president, and he will find it very difficult to bring both sides to any kind of agreement in a short amount of time.
Mm. Well, we shall see. We only have 2 weeks to find out, don't we? Major General Mick Ryan, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts. It's always fascinating, and your analysis is much appreciated. Thank you very much for joining Frontline.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to join you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.